On India.
Okay.
Imagine a nation teetering on the edge of economic collapse, barely weeks of import reserves left.
Yeah, a real nail biter.
It was a tense time for sure.
Oh, absolutely. The weight of the country's future all on the shoulders of the newly appointed finance minister, Manmohan Singh.
Right, Manmohan Singh.
Yes.
A name that's basically synonymous with those reforms.
Right.
But what we're going to uncover today is that it wasn't just him. There was this whole team of economists and advisors all working together to pull off what seemed like almost impossible.
Right, and it's their stories that are almost more fascinating. All the internal debates and disagreements, even a little bit of drama.
I love it.
Some of the names involved might even surprise you.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit first.
Okay.
Before we get to this economic rescue squad,
Right.
we need to understand how bad things actually were.
Yes.
What was the state of the Indian economy before 1991?
Okay, so picture a system where the government controlled basically every single aspect of business.
Okay.
That was the license Raj.
Okay.
And you needed permission for everything.
Wow.
What to produce, how much to produce, even the size of your factory.
Wow.
It really stifled innovation and growth.
So businesses were basically trapped in this web of bureaucracy, like drowning in paperwork.
Yeah.
No wonder the economy is struggling.
Precisely. It was definitely a system that needed some serious reform.
Yeah.
And that's where our first key player enters the picture. Montek Singh Ahluwalia.
Okay.
He held some really important positions during this time. Commerce Secretary, Economic Affairs, and then finally Finance Secretary.
Wow. So this wasn't just like a temporary gig.
No, not at all.
This was a deep level of involvement.
Yes.
And shows a lot of trust from the higher-ups.
Absolutely.
He must have been like a steady hand in the midst of all this chaos.
Oh, for sure.
And I even read that he later became deputy chairman of the Planning Commission when Singh was prime minister.
That's right.
So clearly this wasn't just a working relationship,
No.
but a long-lasting partnership.
Absolutely. Their close bond and their shared understanding of all the challenges that were going on really must have helped to make these reforms work.
Yeah, for sure.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing within the team.
Okay.
Let's bring in SP Shukla.
All right.
He was the finance secretary when the crisis first hit.
Okay.
Kind of carried over from the previous government.
So he represented like the old guard then?
Yeah, you could see that.
Did he clash at all with this new reform agenda?
Well, interestingly enough, he did push back against some of the reforms that were being proposed, along with the chief economic advisor at the time, Deepak Nayyar.
Okay.
They both had concerns about how fast and how big these changes were. They were worried about the potential negative impact on like domestic industries if things moved too quickly.
So even within the team, there were these tensions and different opinions on how to handle the crisis. It really makes you think about the pressure they were under.
Oh, yeah?
Trying to balance all these different concerns while also dealing with this ticking economic time bomb.
A ticking time bomb for sure.
And to make things even more interesting,
Yes.
Shukla was actually replaced mid-crisis
by
KP Geethakrishnan.
Talk about stepping into a pressure cooker.
Oh my gosh.
That's got to be tough.
So Geethakrishnan is credited with something called the Geethakrishnan effect.
Right.
What was that all about?
So to get a bailout from the International Monetary Fund.
The IMF?
Yes, the IMF, India had to meet all these really strict conditions.
Oh, I bet.
And one of those was hitting a specific target for the country's fiscal deficit.
So basically how much the government is spending compared to how much they're taking in.
Exactly.
If they're spending way more than they're bringing in, that's not good.
No, it's a big problem. And the IMF, they wanted to see that deficit reduced.
Okay.
Well, Geethakrishnan, he was a sharp guy.
Yeah.
You found a creative solution. He tapped into a surplus from this oil pool account.
Okay.
And that helped them meet that IMF target.
Wow.
And ultimately paved the way for that bailout.
So it was like finding hidden treasure to pay off a debt or something.
Yeah, something like that.
I also read that after retiring, Geethakrishnan actually went on to work for the IMF.
He did.
Clearly a man who knew global finance inside and out.
He definitely did. Now let's go back to Deepak Nayyar, who we mentioned before.
Okay.
He was the chief economic advisor during this whole chaotic time.
Wow.
Imagine being the point person for your country.
Yeah.
Negotiating with the IMF and the World Bank
Oh my God.
for your nation's survival.
That's a lot of pressure.
An incredible amount of responsibility.
Yeah.
Trying to balance the demands of these huge institutions with the needs of India's struggling economy.
Yeah.
It could have been easy.
Yeah.
Now let's shift our focus a bit to the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI.
Okay.
That's the central bank.
Okay.
S. Venkataramanan was the RBI governor at the time.
Okay.
And what's really interesting about Venkataramanan is that he actually predicted that the country was going to become economically vulnerable years earlier.
Wow.
But nobody listened to him.
Oh, no.
So he must have felt pretty vindicated.
Yeah.
But also burdened.
Right.
With having to fix this problem that he saw coming.
And did he manage to fix it?
He did. Facing dwindling foreign exchange reserves, Venkataramanan did something pretty bold.
Okay.
He arranged for physical gold to be shipped all the way to the UK as collateral.
Wow.
That move secured a $400 million loan.
Wow.
And provided some much-needed relief.
So they were pulling out all the stops?
They were.
Using gold as collateral? That's a pretty big move.
It really shows how desperate the situation had become.
Yeah.
And then there was C. Rangarajan.
Okay.
He was the RBI deputy governor.
Right.
Rangarajan was the guy in charge of the rupee devaluation.
Okay. Now, devaluation, for those of us who aren't economists, can sound a little intimidating. Could you break it down in simple terms?
Sure. So essentially it means lowering the value of the rupee compared to other currencies.
Okay.
So this makes Indian exports cheaper on the global market. Hopefully boosts sales.
Okay.
And brings in more foreign currency.
All right.
At the same time, it also makes imports more expensive.
Okay.
Which encourages people to buy domestic products.
So it's like a balancing act?
Yeah.
Trying to encourage domestic spending while also making your products more attractive abroad?
Exactly. And to implement this devaluation, they had this 3-phase plan.
Okay.
And it was nicknamed Hop, Skip, and Jump.
I love that.
Yeah.
It makes this whole complex financial thing sound almost fun.
It does. And there's actually a funny anecdote about this plan.
Okay.
So after the first devaluation, the Hop Prime Minister Singh called Rangarajan and urged him to hold back on the second round, the skip. But Rangarajan had already executed the jump.
He jumped ahead?
He did the final and largest devaluation.
I can just imagine that phone call.
Oh, yeah.
Hold on, not yet.
Yeah.
Too late, already jumped.
Exactly.
It just shows how fast things were moving.
Oh, yeah.
And how much pressure they were all under.
Absolutely.
So we've met a few of these key players.
Yes.
Ahluwalia, Shukla, Geethakrishnan, Nayyar. Venkataramanan and Rangarajan.
Yes.
What a diverse group of minds.
It really was a team effort.
It was.
But now I have a question for you and our listeners.
Okay.
How did this group dynamic, with all the disagreements and agreements, actually contribute to the success or failure of the reforms?
That's a great question.
What do you think? Yeah, it's a really fascinating question to think about.
It is.
How each of these personalities, their strengths, their weaknesses, might have played a role in this incredibly pivotal moment for India.
Absolutely. We're talking about real people with real lives.
Yes.
Making decisions that impacted millions.
Yes, and under immense pressure.
So much pressure.
Speaking of pressure, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or I guess the institution across the ocean, the International Monetary Fund.
Ah, the IMF. They always seem to show up in these economic crisis stories.
You too.
Like the lender of last resort.
Yeah, India was right on the verge of defaulting on their loans, a country unable to pay its debts.
Yeah.
The consequences would have been absolutely devastating.
So the IMF steps in, offers a lifeline.
Right.
But I'm guessing it wasn't just a handout.
No, not exactly.
There must have been some strings attached.
You're right. The IMF operates on this principle of conditionality.
Conditionality.
Kind of like a tough love approach.
Okay.
So they agree to lend the money, but only if the receiving country implements specific economic policies.
Okay, so what kind of policies are we talking about?
Well, things like reducing government spending.
Okay.
Sometimes called austerity measures.
Yeah.
Devaluing the currency, which we already talked about. Or opening up more to foreign trade.
So it's a trade-off. You get the money you desperately need.
Yeah.
But you also have to pay by the IMF's rules.
In a way, yes.
Which might not always be what everyone in the country wants.
That's true.
Yeah.
It sparked a lot of debate in India at the time. Some people argued that these conditions infringed on India's economic sovereignty.
Right.
Basically forcing them to adopt policies they wouldn't have chosen otherwise.
Yeah.
Others saw it as a necessary evil. The only way to prevent total economic collapse.
Right. So it must have been a very tricky situation.
It was.
For Manmohan Singh and his team trying to navigate these external pressures while also doing what they thought was best for India.
Absolutely. And we also have to remember The global context.
Right.
The collapse of the Soviet Union was happening around the same time.
Wow. I didn't even think about that.
It had major implications for India, both
Yeah.
politically and economically.
So the world is undergoing these massive changes.
Yeah.
And India is facing this economic crisis.
Right.
The IMF is at the door with all these conditions,
Mm.
and the geopolitical landscape is shifting under their feet.
It was a time of great uncertainty for
Yeah.
sure. But in the midst of all this turmoil, they managed to push through a set of reforms,
Okay.
often called the 1991 liberalization.
Okay.
These reforms marked a significant turning point for
Uh,
India's economy.
So let's break down these reforms a bit.
Okay.
What were some of the key changes?
One of the most significant was dismantling that license raj that we talked about earlier.
Uh-huh.
They started deregulating industries,
Okay.
reducing all those bureaucratic hurdles,
Yeah.
and simplifying the process for businesses to actually operate.
So like clearing out the cobwebs, cutting through all that red tape,
Exactly.
letting businesses breathe a little.
Yeah, and they opened the door to foreign investment,
Okay.
allowing foreign companies to come in and set up shop in India.
Wow.
This brought in much-needed capital, introduced new technologies,
Yeah.
and in a lot of cases, increased competition in the market.
So it was a massive shift away from that closed state-controlled economy
It was.
and moving towards a more open market-driven model.
Yes, a bold move.
Yeah.
And the results weren't immediate.
Right.
But these reforms really laid the foundation for the incredible economic growth
Yeah.
that India has experienced in the decades since.
It's amazing to think about
It is.
that those decisions made by this group of people back in 1991
Right.
have had such a lasting impact on India's
A
economy.
lasting impact, for sure. And it really emphasizes what we were saying before about teamwork,
Yeah.
leadership,
Uh-huh.
and the courage to make these really tough decisions
Yeah.
under so much pressure.
Yes.
These reforms weren't just some abstract economic theory.
Right.
They were about people,
Yeah.
real people making real decisions with real consequences.
It's one thing to read about these events in a textbook,
It is.
but to hear about the individuals involved,
Yeah.
the debates, the drama, it really brings history to life.
It does. It reminds us that economics isn't just about numbers and graphs.
Right.
It's about people's lives.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered the crisis, the IMF's role,
Right.
and some of the key reforms.
Yeah.
But what about the aftermath?
Good question.
What happened in the short term,
Mm-hmm.
and how did these changes impact India in the long run?
Right. Because I imagine it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Yeah.
These reforms must have had some ripple effects
Oh, yeah, for sure.
throughout the country.
Absolutely. So no pain, no gain, right?
Well, in a lot of ways, yes.
Okay.
Over the long term, these reforms did lead to increased economic growth,
Uh-huh.
reduced poverty,
Okay.
and much more integrated India in the global economy.
Good.
But it's important to remember that these benefits weren't distributed equally across society.
So some groups benefited more than others?
Exactly.
Okay.
For example, skilled workers, those in like new and emerging sectors,
Okay.
often prospered under these new policies.
Okay.
But others, particularly those in rural areas or in more traditional industries,
Yeah.
faced a lot of hardship.
So it's important to acknowledge that complexity
It is.
and really consider the experiences of those who might have been left behind.
Absolutely.
Uh,
So while the overall picture might look positive,
right.
there were definitely winners and losers during
Yeah.
this period of economic change.
Yeah, a lot of change
A
happening.
lot of change. But overall, the 1991 liberalization is seen as a real turning point,
Yeah.
a catalyst that helped propel India to where it is today,
Right.
a major global player.
It's incredible to think about how those decisions
It is.
made in the middle of all that uncertainty and pressure
Yeah,
are still shaping India's economy today.
they are. But before we move on,
Okay.
I think we need to zoom out a bit
All right.
and look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
We've been focused on economic players,
Right.
the reforms, the IMF,
Mm-hmm.
but economic crises don't just happen out of nowhere.
Right.
What about the political forces at play during this time?
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's easy to get caught up in the economics of it all,
Yeah.
but the political backdrop must have been just as dramatic and influential.
Absolutely. So let's delve into the world of Indian politics.
Okay.
The Prime Minister at the time was P.V. Narasimha Rao,
Yes,
a seasoned politician from the Indian National Congress Party.
he was.
Narasimha Rao, I've heard the name,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't really know much about his role in all of this.
Well, he played a crucial role.
Okay.
He's often given credit for providing the political cover and support that allowed Manmohan Singh and his team to actually implement those bold and, let's face it, sometimes unpopular reforms.
So he was like the political mastermind.
Yeah, in a way, yes.
Okay.
He really understood the severity of the crisis, and he was willing to make those tough decisions, even if it meant facing opposition from his own party or other powerful interests.
So he had to be a really skilled political operator.
He did.
Able to navigate all the complexities of Indian politics to get these big changes through.
He was known for being a shrewd political maneuverer.
Okay.
His ability to build consensus and outmaneuver his opponents, and his partnership with Manmohan Singh, who had all the economic expertise, proved to be really effective.
Like a dynamic duo.
It was.
Yeah.
They really helped to navigate this complex political landscape.
Yeah.
Think about it. A fragmented parliament, a powerful opposition, and even disagreement within their own party.
Yeah.
Rao and Singh had to manage all of that while trying to steer the country through this massive economic crisis.
That's a lot to juggle.
It was a constant battle.
Yeah.
Juggling competing interests.
Right.
Trying to keep different factions happy.
Yeah.
Convincing all the skeptics.
Wow.
It was a testament to their leadership, their political skills, maybe even their sheer willpower.
Yeah.
That they were able to overcome all these hurdles. And implement these reforms.
It wasn't just about numbers and theories.
No.
It was about people.
Yes.
Personalities. Power dynamics. And that delicate dance of politics. And that's what makes this whole story so interesting.
It really is.
It shows how economic decisions are never made in a vacuum.
Right.
They're always shaped by the political context, by the people involved, and how power plays into all of it.
It's fascinating.
And sometimes it takes a crisis, a perfect storm of events, for create the conditions for truly radical change.
It seems like that's often the case.
It is.
A crisis can be a real catalyst for innovation, for challenging the status quo, and for bold leadership. Well, we've definitely explored a crisis.
We have.
A team of innovators.
Yes.
And some bold leadership today.
We have.
This deep dive into India's 1991 economic rescue.
Yeah.
It's been a roller coaster
of
intrigue, economics, and political maneuvering.
And a lot going on. It has been a fascinating story.
And it's a story that still resonates today.
Right.
It offers valuable lessons about leadership, economic policy.
Yeah.
And that fascinating relationship between politics and economics.
And as always, we encourage you, our listeners, to continue exploring,
to keep questioning,
to keep digging deeper
into this really fascinating chapter of history.
Absolutely.
Who knows?
Yeah.
You might even uncover some new perspectives that we haven't even touched on today.
Exactly. Okay. But let's shift our focus a bit.
Okay.
We've been looking at the big picture. But what about the human element?
Right.
You know, amid all the economic jargon and the political strategy.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that real people were affected by these decisions.
Yeah. What were the social consequences of these reforms?
Exactly.
How did they impact the everyday lives of people all across India?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
And one that often gets overlooked in these grand narratives of economic transformation.
So let's bring it to the forefront. Let's go from the macro level to the micro level.
Okay.
From the halls of government to the streets and homes of people all across India.
Let's explore the human side of this story.
Yeah.
The stories of resilience, adaptation, and that uneven distribution of gains and losses that came with these profound changes.
I'm ready to dive in.
Let's do it.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, you know, in the economic growth, the trade figures. But real change is felt on the ground level.
It is.
In the everyday lives of people.
Absolutely. And the 1991 liberalization, while it was ultimately good for India's economy, it brought about some major changes that really affected different groups in different ways.
So can you paint us a picture? What were some of those immediate impacts?
Well, one of the most noticeable was just the influx of new goods and services.
Oh, wow.
Remember, before liberalization, India had a pretty closed economy. Very limited access to foreign products.
So it was like going from a time capsule to a world of abundance.
Yeah, kind of.
After years of limited choices.
Suddenly, store shelves were stocked with all these imported goods, electronics, clothing, food items.
Wow.
Things that were either unavailable before or super expensive.
That's got to be exciting for consumers.
It was a really exciting time. But on the flip side,
Yeah.
how did this sudden influx of competition affect domestic businesses?
Right. Well, that's where things get a little more complicated.
Oh.
Some businesses did really well.
Yeah.
They embraced the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
They adapted to this new competitive environment.
Okay.
But others really struggled to keep up.
Uh-huh.
The removal of those protectionist policies that had been shielding them for so long meant they suddenly had to compete with global players.
So it's that classic case of creative destruction.
Exactly.
Some doors closing, some doors opening.
Yeah, and the impact varied a lot depending on the industry.
Okay, so give us some examples. Sure. Some sectors like technology and services really flourished under these new conditions.
Okay.
But those more traditional industries like manufacturing often faced some pretty big challenges.
So we've talked about consumers, businesses, but what about the average worker?
Right.
How did all of this affect jobs and livelihoods?
That's a really important piece of this whole story.
It is.
This shift towards a more market-driven economy.
Right.
It did create jobs in some sectors, especially those that were now open to foreign investment and global trade.
Yeah.
But it also led to job losses in other industries,
Right.
those that just weren't as competitive.
Yeah.
So there was a period of adjustment where people had to learn new skills, adapt to the changing demands of the market.
It sounds like a time of both hope and uncertainty.
It was.
The promise of new opportunities, but also the fear of being left behind.
Exactly. And we have to remember that not everyone benefited equally from this liberalization.
Right.
Some groups, like skilled workers, those in those emerging sectors, they often prospered.
Okay.
But others, especially those in rural areas or in those declining industries, faced some really difficult times.
So even though the overall picture seemed to be getting brighter, the light wasn't shining on everyone.
That's true. It's important to acknowledge that these economic transformations, they always have winners and losers.
Always a bit of a trade-off, it seems.
It does seem that way. Okay, so now we've talked about consumers, businesses, and the workforce. But what about the social and cultural side of India?
Right.
Did these economic changes have a broader impact on society? They did. The opening up of the economy. It also had these cultural ripple effects.
Interesting.
Suddenly there was all this exposure to global trends and lifestyles.
Right.
And that really influenced things like consumer behavior, fashion, entertainment.
It's amazing how economics and culture are so intertwined.
They are.
I imagine this wasn't always an easy transition.
No, it wasn't. There were all these debates and anxieties about how to embrace these new global influences while still holding on to India's unique cultural identity.
That's a balancing act.
It is. It was, and in many ways still is, a conversation about finding that balance between tradition and modernity.
Yeah, a challenge a lot of societies face as they become more globalized.
It is. So we've looked at those short-term impacts. But what about the long-term ones?
Right.
How did these 1991 reforms actually shape the India we see today?
Well, a lot of experts point to 1991 as the foundation for India's economic success.
They do.
They say those reforms, although painful for some at the time, really unleashed this wave of entrepreneurial energy, attracted foreign investment, and really integrated India into the global economy. So those tough decisions made back then really set the stage for the India we see now.
They did.
This rising economic powerhouse.
In many ways, yes. Of course, there are a lot of other factors that have contributed to India's rise. But those 1991 reforms were a real turning point. They opened up so many possibilities and paved the way for decades of economic growth and the emergence of this large and vibrant Indian middle class.
It's amazing how a single set of decisions made during a time of crisis can have such a huge impact on the future of a nation.
It really highlights how history is this chain of events.
It does.
And the choices we make in the past continue to shape both the present and the future.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today.
We have.
From the brink of collapse to the rise of a global power.
From those initial reforms to their lasting legacy.
Exactly. We met the key players, explored those complex reforms, and most importantly, we looked at how all of this affected the lives of everyday people.
That's what it's all about at the end of the day.
It's been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
Full of insights and drama.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a good reminder that economics at its core is really about people.
It is.
It's about their livelihoods,
Yeah.
their aspirations,
Their challenges.
their challenges.
And their triumphs.
Well said. And as always, we encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring.
Keep asking those questions.
Keep questioning.
And keep diving deeper.
Into this fascinating world of economics and history.
You never know what you might find.
Exactly. So until next time, happy deep diving.